My name is Henry Lee, and I'm the Executive Director of Harvard's Energy and Environmental Policy Center. On behalf of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, the Institute of Politics, and if I can be so presumptuous as to speak for them, the International Tusk Fund, I would like to welcome you to the ARCO Forum for what I believe will be a most provocative and important discussion. The slaughter of the wild African elephant has shocked the world and has raised the fear that ours might be the generation which witnesses the extinction of perhaps the most magnificent of all animals. This event could not be more better timed. I would like to welcome our distinguished panel, Dr. Richard Garstang, Dr. Ian Douglas Hamilton, and Dr. Richard Leakey. For all of us who have wondered about the origins of our species, the Leakey family occupies a very special spot in our heart, and it's a great privilege to have you here with us tonight. Our moderator tonight will be Dr. Richard Estes. Our original moderator, Mr. Vitachi, is stuck in traffic in New York. Dr. Estes is a member of the Species Survival Commission of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He's the chairman of the Antelope Specialist Group, and he's associate in mammalogy here at Harvard, and he's a lecturer at the Harvard Extension School. Dr. Estes.
Thank you very much. I think I have a built-in excuse for having a rather rough presentation, since I only found out at 4 o'clock in Peterborough, New Hampshire, that I was expected to be moderator tonight, all other suitable candidates having fallen by the wayside. I'm also supposed to introduce the speakers, but most of you already know who they are. You wouldn't be here, although the interest in the African elephant is what might motivate you to come anyway, in spite of the weather. I have spent 8 years doing field research myself in Africa, most of it in Tanzania, and some of it in Kenya and other parts, including Angola. And I also lead tour groups several times, 2 or 3 times a year, to the Serengeti, Ngorongoro Crater, and wonderful places like that where I lived before. And until about 2 years ago, I did not notice that there had been any great change in the Serengeti National Park or in the other places. And I used to tell my people that going to the Serengeti and Ngorongoro, you were seeing Africa as great, in as great numbers of wildlife as you would have when the first white man came to the continent. Nothing had really changed. However, that was disregarding the fact that the rhino, the black rhino, had been exterminated during the period between 76 and 79, roughly. Frankly, the entire population of about 700 had gone, and now the black rhino is virtually gone over the whole of Africa. However, you don't notice it that much because the rhino was not one of the major ecological factors. When it comes to the African elephant, it's something different. The African elephant is second only to man in its effect on ecosystems as a clearing agent, an animal that was knocking down trees when you built up the density in the parks. As settlement outside crowded the elephant into smaller spaces, then we had major problems in Kenya. In every country that had national parks, virtually, they had an elephant problem through the 60s and the 70s, and there were elephant cropping to try to stop the damage of knocking down all the trees, all the baobab trees, the very colorful big trees. All the acacias were suffering, and the Serengeti National Park woodland zone was opened up to tree grassland in a period of about 15 years. And now, in the last few years, because of the poaching, the elephant the elephant population has dropped. As Ian Douglas Hamilton's work has shown, that it's gone down by about 50% in the last 10 years, from over 1 million, maybe 1.3 million, 1.5 million, down to maybe a total of 750,000. I'm not sure that isn't a rather optimistic figure at this point, because a lot of the assumptions that the forest elephants, for instance, in the Congo, in the great rainforest areas, are still there in large numbers. But whether they really are or not, it's incredible how extensively poaching can go when there's this tremendous profit motive. And now when I go back to the Serengeti, I find there's a big difference because the elephant is no longer so easy to see. There's about 300 left of elephants from 3,000 a few years ago. And a lot of them have fled into Kenya Mara across the border because they're safer from poachers because of all the tourists. Anyway, if the elephant goes, something that's really that's part of the scene that cannot be replaced and is extremely important for other species is going to go. So we have here tonight a discussion of that, the whole world of animals in the world. And there are two different views. There are the people I'd say the majority of people in this country want to see elephant shooting stopped altogether, and trade in ivory, anything to do with ivory, just banned and stopped. They had a recent meeting of CITES when this was thrashed out. But the different point of view is represented in southern Africa, particularly in Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, where there has a much more elaborate, much more money, much more elaborate organization for wildlife and parks, comparable to what we have in this country. And there they have a handle on the poaching. They have an elephant surplus problem, the same problem we had in East Africa before this poaching got going. Namely, the elephants are destroying their own habitat, and they're limited now. They're confined. They're behind fences. What do you do if you don't shoot them? They're going to eat themselves out of house and home and destroy the habitat for a lot of other animals at the same time. So we have, in the person of Richard Garstang, who is the one name that may be unfamiliar to you, we have someone who was going to represent the other side, because he comes from South Africa. He's a distinguished researcher in his own right. I happened to meet him in 1982 in Kruger National Park, where he was stationed at the time, and he had done a master's thesis study, long-term study on the topi or sesame antelope, as they call it down there. And since antelopes are my specialty, and I had worked on the topi in the Serengeti, I was very interested in his research and very impressed with some of the things he'd found out, which I hadn't even thought of looking at in the Serengeti. That's an aside. So he's been in this country. I just found out when somehow the Kennedy School located him down in Connecticut, where he's representing a number of conservation organizations, the Endangered Wildlife Trust, these are mostly Southern African, Vulture Study Group, Wildlife Society of Southern Africa, the South African Ornithological Society. He also represents the recently formed Rhino and Elephant Foundation, headed by the Zulu chief minister, Buthelezi, King Buthelezi, King of the Zulus, who was a fabulous character too. So he's come up from Connecticut to represent that other view. And I think the order of speakers is going to be first Richard Leakey discussing the problem in Kenya, which a lot of you read about in East Africa in general. Each speaker is going to talk for 10 minutes. First Richard Leakey, and then Richard Garstang was going to present the other view about how can we stop cropping and what are we supposed to do with these products, throw them away, burn them. And then third will be Ian Douglas Hamilton, who will give a Pan-African view. He's been studying the elephant all over Africa. He's devoted his entire career since doing his PhD in Amboseli National Park. Excuse me, not Amboseli, woo, that was a slip. Manyara National Park in Tanzania back in the early 70s, and he's been covering the whole continent doing aerial surveys and being very much involved in their conservation. So having now taken almost as much time as the other speakers, I will now call on Richard Leakey.
Thank you very much. I must begin by saying that my expertise is not in conservation, nor is my expertise in any way related to the protection of African elephants. I like to think I had some experience, if not expertise, in the study of human origins, but if you read recent books, I didn't have that either. Nonetheless, I am responsible directly and personally and officially at this time for Kenya's elephants, and the decisions I make will affect what happens in Kenya for the time being. Being in the hot seat is different from being close to it or opposite or away from it. And one of the things that has become very clear to me in the very short time that I have had personal responsibility for decision-making in Kenya on wildlife is that in conservation there are many, many different opinions and shades of opinions. Paleoanthropology distressed me to a certain extent because of the contention and bickering and preoccupation with territory. The advice that I've got in my new job suggests to me that wildlife biology and wildlife conservation in particular is just as difficult and just as fraught with all those currents and undercurrents. Yet, when looking at the origin, it doesn't really matter if we get it right. But looking at the survival of the African elephant and the survival of the habitats in which the elephant live does matter if we don't get it right. So it is a different forum. It is a different situation. There are different stresses and different pressures. The situation in Kenya has been portrayed in the press as an example of a country that got things wrong, a country that failed, a country that, through mismanagement and gross corruption, let the wildlife go down the chute. And Kenya wildlife is frequently spoken of almost in the past tense. We have watched the decline of elephants in Africa, and in particular in Kenya, with dismay, and although little was done until recently, a lot was done to evaluate and assess the causes and the reasons for what was going wrong. And I believe very sincerely, that the experience in Kenya should not be flushed away and forgotten, but should be seen as a very real lesson of what can happen in a country that has enormous aspirations in terms of political development, individual development, and a commitment to a change from basically a feudal, agrarian, subsistence background under colonial domination to a modern market economy, open society. The days of Karen Blixen, the days of Out of Africa, the days when the African elephant and the other species had the freedom to roam wherever they wished, are gone in Kenya. The days are gone in Kenya when the land upon which agriculture was to be developed were confined to a few large-scale farms owned by wealthy white farmers. Today, funds are available from multilateral, multinational, as well as bilateral and philanthropic organizations to develop schemes that can turn semi-desert into productive land through irrigation, through the manipulation of the genetics of plants. Viable horticultural schemes can be established adjacent to areas where wildlife exists or once abounded. In a country like Kenya, we are seeing a very fundamental and dramatic transformation of attitudes to land use. And the idea that traditional use of land can be continued and that the so-called native population can be allowed to benefit, but benefit with a fixed ceiling from wildlife by wildlife utilization on their communal land, is gone and gone forever in Kenya. In Kenya, every single one of our people seeks ultimately, as you do in this bastion of democracy and freedom of America, to own his or her own property. People want to own title to land so they can use that title to leverage and negotiate loans and to offer security for the development of their families and their lifestyles and make a commitment to their future. Conservation of wildlife, and particularly the survival of the African elephant in Kenya, has got to be seen against that backdrop. I am absolutely convinced, beyond any doubt at all, that the African elephant will survive in Kenya, but it will only survive in areas of land that are set aside for the purposes of elephant survival. The national parks, the game reserves, and the sanctuaries, and perhaps private land where the landowner particularly and specifically wishes his or her land to be used for that purpose. But wildlife, and particularly destructive wildlife such as the elephant, will no longer be allowed, or will indeed be seen, to roam freely across our country. Many of the elephant that have been killed in Kenya have been killed outside national parks, but many of the elephant that have been killed in Kenya over the past decade have been killed inside national parks. The elephant population of Kenya has dropped from 65,000 to less than 18,000 in the last decade. To a very large extent, the catastrophic destruction of elephant in Kenya was a direct reflection of the very high value of ivory, to which others will speak, and the fact that in Kenya a great deal of money could be made by the sale of ivory. We had in Kenya a situation where, as a result of political interference, as a result of nepotism, as a result of other forms of corruption, ill-trained and inappropriate personnel were placed in positions of responsibility for the protection of our natural heritage. We were expecting men and women earning less than $100 a month to protect resources of such a value that there was no comparison with their position. We're expecting men and women to turn a blind eye or not involve themselves in a trade that in a few weeks could make the difference between their children going from primary to secondary school and secondary school to university. We expected people earning $100 a month to receive, without batting an eyelid, revenues of $5,000 and $6,000 a week that was supposed to be passed to government and into the central exchequer to support whatever it was that the government proposed to do with that money. We have never once attempted to pay those who protect our wildlife the value of that wildlife. We have never recognized the importance of doing that. We believe, and we believe strongly, that the Kenya experience is typical of many parts of Africa, even those parts of Africa that today boast a different set of standards. Certain parts of Africa have only had their independence 10, 12 or less years. There are still institutions in place that have not been interfered with. The chances are they will be. If you had come to Kenya in 1973, we had an excess of elephants, we had communally owned land, and we had the utilization of wildlife on communally owned land, where the people on that land benefited from the utilization of that wildlife. We don't have communally owned land, and if we do, it is no longer likely to remain so. We have a situation in our country where wildlife has been grossly abused because of the requirements of the people responsible for looking after it. But rather than say that Kenya has let the wildlife go down the drain, let us examine just for a moment what Kenya has in fact done in the past 8 months. And let me, in a few moments, and perhaps later in this program, illustrate what we will do. We believe that for so long as there is a need and there is a way to satisfy that need, trade will continue. And we firmly believe that whilst ivory enjoyed a high price, poor people would find ways to kill elephant, to sell the ivory, to satisfy their basic requirements. If there was little risk involved, the volume of that illegal trade would increase, and indeed it did. We believe that even though we can arrest 300 poachers one year and 500 the next, for so long as there is a growing trade in ivory, 500 more will come to take their place and continue to kill our elephant. We believe that it was fundamental to stop the trade, and we believe the way to do it was to stop the end user from participating in that trade. And that is you. That is the ordinary decent folk in America, Canada, Austria, Switzerland, and wherever there is a consumer market. We believed it necessary to persuade decent folk that the wearing of baubles and trinkets was not conducive to programs aimed at ensuring the survival of a key species of African wildlife. It was for that reason that Kenya burnt its stocks of ivory. Some of our friends laughed loudly. Some of our friends considered us to be as stupid as they had often feared. I have heard it said people were desperate to learn that this idiot who knew nothing about human evolution was now in charge of wildlife, and the first action he recommended was proof of his stupidity. Let me tell you that last week patrols in Tanzania and in Kenya have found ivory that has been discarded by the poacher. Discarded because they cannot sell that ivory to anybody in Tanzania or Kenya. Let me tell you that the price of ivory in many parts of the world is 50% lower today than it was 6 months ago. I do not believe that the burning of ivory was stupid, and I do not believe that it was a wasted gesture. I believe the people of the world are responding now to the crisis, and in Kenya at any rate, with the decrease in pressure on the elephant, it has been possible to control the poaching itself. We were losing 3 elephant a day up until middle May this year from poachers in our national parks. Since the middle of May, without the SAS and without help from the American Marines, but with our own bare hands and arms supplied by our government, we haven't lost, as far as I'm aware, a single elephant in any of our national parks from the 15th of May to this time. This was done. More can be done. I believe that South Africa, Zimbabwe, and other South African countries that have an excess population today and have legitimately earned revenue have had to sacrifice that revenue. The amounts concerned in terms of the international trade in the ivory itself is relatively modest. And if the world cannot find a way to seek compensation for their losses, it is a less satisfactory world than I believe it to be. The concern that I have, however, is that some people from Southern Africa do not want to accept what they consider to be charity. It is not charity. It is accepting a willingness to save surely one of the most noble species that we have. I was asked to be provocative. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Silver-tongued orator as always. Now I'd like to call on Richard Garstang to present the viewpoint from Southern Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. After that sally, I think I should roll my sleeves up as well. I wonder how many of you realize that the geological feature that is called the Rift Valley in East Africa actually extends down almost the entire length of the African continent. In the southern part, it's more in the form of an escarpment, a one-sided escarpment that has an eastern aspect, and it passes through a whole range of countries, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, eventually tails off into the sea on the wild coast of the Transkei. And for the best part of its length, it's a beautiful geological feature, one that abounds in a rich diversity of wildlife. And so, not unsurprisingly, over the years, there have been a large number of important national parks proclaimed along the length of that fissure in Africa's surface. I had the pleasure of running one of the most beautiful of those national parks for about 5 years, back in the 70s. It's called Bladder Canyon, and probably very few of you have heard of it. The headquarters of Bladder Canyon National Park are located at a place called Bergsluk, named after some prospector in the early days. And it happens to be the exact location where an ancient elephant trail passes up from the low-veld plain to the high-veld about 4,000 feet higher on the escarpment. If you look at the headquarters of Bergsluk National Park from the east, it is silhouetted against a mountain which the Sutus call Taba Yatlu, Elephant Mountain, or Mountain of Elephants, named for the thousands of elephants that used to tramp that trail every summer to move up to the spring grasses that were produced on the escarpment edge. I was standing there on a spring morning with my senior ranger when a very dusty and way-worn VW microbus pulled up at the entrance gates. It had West German registration plates, as I recall, and I noticed immediately that plastered all around the windshield was a double row of souvenir stickers. Amboseli, Masai Mara, Celu, Chobe, Etosha, Kruger, Addo Elephant National Park, Hluhluwe, Umfolozi, every major national park in Africa was mentioned there. And I turned to Richard Smith, who was standing next to me, just in time to have this hardy and experienced and down-to-earth conservation officer say to me, "Look at this bastard, he's more interested in where he's been than where he's going." Ladies and gentlemen, I'm more interested in where I'm going than where I've been as far as this issue is concerned. Now, let me first of all explain to you where I come from. My constituency is the Southern African sub-region. It's the region south of the Zambezi and Kanani rivers. It comprises approximately 1/5 of all sub-Saharan Africa. Now, to get that into a little bit of perspective, if you compare that to the East African countries of Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, they comprise approximately 1/10 of the surface area of sub-Saharan Africa. The region is split approximately 50-50 into southern savanna and arid semi-desert. And elephants occupy both of those environments. And the elephant population of the region is approximately 10% of the surviving population of elephants on Earth. So my constituents are approximately 10% of Africa's surviving elephants, and they're also the scientists of that region, the expatriates, the naturalized people like myself. I'm a 5th generation South African, and the indigenous scientists. Collectively, we represent hundreds of years of intense work on the wildlife of that region. Now let me see what sort of a story I have to tell you before we look forward. The elephants, the major elephant populations within the Southern African sub-region are increasing at a rate of around 5 to 6% per annum, in direct contradiction to the existing trends elsewhere in Africa. On the other hand, the amount of elephant range which is currently available is only increasing at a very modest rate because it takes a lot of money to purchase land for national parks these days. You could almost regard the rate of increase of elephant range in southern Africa as being insignificant, as it is elsewhere in Africa. So the amount of space is finite. The elephant populations, on the other hand, are increasing. We know of no viable means within the scope of current scientific knowledge of administering birth control to elephants in large numbers. We also know of no economically acceptable method of catching and translocating large numbers of African elephant. And were we to know of such a technique, where would we take them to? We therefore have a very difficult bottom line to face. An increasing population of elephants with nowhere to go. The response to this on the part of the Zimbabwean National Parks Department and the South African Department of National Parks, and very soon I believe Botswana will have to follow, has been to take the unpleasant step of having to decide to cull their excess elephant every year. Now, there is a lot of emotion out in this audience tonight about elephants being killed in the short term. I'd like to call a moratorium on short-term emotion and transpose it into a motivational force for long-term constructive thinking. Either we control the elephant populations in the short term in the Southern African sub-region and do so in an economically acceptable way, or else we will face the sort of exercise which has already been completed disastrously in national parks to the north of us. I don't believe there's any necessity to repeat a Tsavo experiment again, ever. Some 20 years ago, for round figures, the Zimbabweans determined that the rate of tree destruction in some of the major national parks there was exceeding the rate of tree replacement. In other words, there was deforestation taking place at the hands, or should I say the trunks, of elephants. Elephants were eating themselves out of house and home. That is the reality of the problem which the Southern Africans have to face, and it's a legacy that they earned themselves for the sake of enduring and effective conservation measures that have been carried out on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to admit the presence of buffer zones to the north of us that have probably absorbed the brunt of illegal poaching. However, poaching is not perceived by us to be the major problem. I think we have to compare apples with apples. We get these dramatic graphs drawn of the decrease in the number of elephant over the years in Africa. I would like to see parallel graphs drawn of the amount of decrease in the available range for elephant in Africa, and perhaps Ian Douglas Hamilton could shed some light on that. I do believe that we would find that there's no way we could ever get back to having as many elephant as we had once, because there isn't anywhere to put them. Certainly as far as the Southern African sub-region is concerned, this is the case. If you'd like to jot down, and some of you are writing down a few facts and figures, write this down. In 1960, by the best available methods of census that existed at that time, the Zimbabwean National Parks Department counted roughly 32,000 elephant. They now have 52,000, which they estimate to exceed their current carrying capacity, and we've just been through a dry cycle, admittedly, by about 19,000. In the interim, having decided to control their elephant herds, they have killed 44,500 elephant. And those 44,500 elephant have been commercialized and have yielded approximately $13 million. I beg your pardon, $18 million, of which 2/3 of the revenue came from the sale of ivory. Now, why is it necessary to sell ivory, or for that matter, to sell any bits and pieces of elephants? From an emotional point of view, there is no apparent reason at all. You probably all read the leading article under the environment in Time of October the 16th. It's called Trail of Shame. It kicks off with a quote from John Donne: "Nature's great masterpiece, an elephant, the only harmless great thing, the giant of beasts." You can tell that John Donne never had to live next to an African elephant. Besides, you know, this man's spelling is atrocious. The problem of making African elephants compatible with Africa's people is what is central to the survival of African elephants in the next century. We have to find a way for these large animals to coexist with the small animals in the herd in front of me tonight. And it's a difficult thing to do. If you're a small crop farmer, one of these animals can come in and wreck everything that you've put your life into in a whole year in a matter of one night. And understandably, put yourself in that position. All that you have is wiped out in one night. There's a modicum of resentment there. The only way that you can justify the existence of such an animal, which has no fundamental aesthetic appeal to these people, is to provide them with some sort of steady income from it. Tourists who will come to view it and take its pictures, hunters who will come to hunt it, and when the time comes to control the elephant, the proceeds of that control in the form of hides and skins, elephant hair, meat to feed people, and ivory, which can be sold at a very high price to defray the expense of carrying out a sophisticated and humane management program. One of the things that we have to be most careful about, having got to the point of deciding to play God, and it's a second stage thing. The first stage in deciding to play God was to procreate at a rate that has exceeded any rate of population growth amongst human beings in all history. That was the first act. The second act is to decide how to manage the animals that are compressed into a smaller and smaller space. And one thing is abundantly clear to me after a 15-year career in national parks, that the process of doing that correctly is expensive. It involves flying airplanes, it involves flying helicopters, it involves maintaining computers and scientifically trained personnel on a year-round basis in the national parks, all of which costs a substantial amount of money. Furthermore, when it comes to the point that you have to actually kill the animals, it behoves us to do this in some sort of a humane fashion. That also costs a lot of money. Now, to talk about $1 or $2 million per annum raised from the sale of culled elephants sounds like very little to people on this side of the ocean. Particularly where I come from in Greenwich, it sounds like very little. However, I must tell you that it represents a substantial portion of the budget of any of the national parks departments concerned in the countries that I represent. It furthermore totally exceeds the annual budgets of most of the national parks that hold the elephant. It is a very, very important carrot to the third world communities that harbor these elephant to be able to say these animals can effectively pay their own way. The track record in Zimbabwe is that 2/3 of the money has come from ivory sales. That 2/3 is now potentially at jeopardy. The 1/3, and you may ask why was it as little, and I'll tell you it was because most of the animals got ploughed back into the indigenous population at very low cost in order to buy goodwill for elephant, in other words, get back a little of what you contributed in the way of maize and other crops that were eaten. That money provides an incentive to those people. It's as simple as that, as far as the balance of maintaining elephant in southern Africa is concerned. Now, just a note on the word ban. We are essentially cynical about bans. Some 15 years ago, trade in rhino horn was banned, since which time 85% of all surviving rhino have died. In southern Africa, you will find the only populations of white and black rhino that are on the increase. In southern Africa, white rhino are at this time commercially utilized in ways other than tourism. They are actually used on the trophy market for hunting. But there is an unprecedented increase in the white rhinoceros. Bans have a nasty habit of driving up the black market price of the commodity that is banned. Let me diverge a little bit from the animal issue because it is such an emotional one. If there are any botanists present, you'll recognize the name cycad. It's a plant that grows around the world between roughly 40 degrees north and 40 degrees south. It speciates almost unendingly. It's a great thing to collect. Almost every national park in our sub-region has 1 or 2 cycad species, and these are collected avidly by plant collectors. In the early 70s, we banned trade in cycads to stop poaching in the wild. Now, up until that point in time, poaching had been on horseback, the odd donkeys, people going in on foot, pilfering, really. When we cut off the supply of legal cycads, because the demand remained, the illegal demand remained, the price was driven up to the point where suddenly the poachers could afford highly modified motor vehicles, even helicopters, to do it. The end of that equation for me as a national parks officer was that I and my staff were outgunned and outrun by better paid criminals. We've already heard that national parks officers are not well paid. They're not well paid anywhere in the world. During the period of Reaganomics, they weren't well paid here either. We have to face the reality that the chances are that a ban will inevitably drive up the price of ivory and increase the impetus for poaching, and perhaps even force the poachers to range a little more widely than what they currently do. We are therefore not in favor of bans on ivory, although we've temporarily agreed, as far as South Africa is concerned, to a 2-year moratorium. It is basically a rain check. We will look again in 2 years. Zimbabwe has decided to flaunt the ban Botswana is not quite sure because Botswana hasn't come to grips with the realities of the problem yet. Thank you. I was about to say, if my time is not up, my thoughts on this matter for the moment certainly are. Thank you very much.
I got so engrossed that I forgot that I was supposed to be keeping track of the time, too. Well, now we have Ian Douglas Hamilton to give us a Pan-African view and settle the whole question for us. Come on, Ian.
This business of the effect of the ivory trade on elephants has been a heated subject for well over a decade. As long as 1979, we came to the end of our first 3-year study, the first attempt to make a Pan-African elephant survey, which I was in charge of, and I concluded that at that time there were at least 1.3 million elephants in Africa, and many critics at the time said that it had been greatly underestimated and there could be in fact as many as 3 million or more. We reported at that time that the continental elephant population was threatened as a whole by the ivory trade, but many authorities concluded that the ivory trade was sustainable. The biggest uncertainty lay within the Central African forests, where nobody knew how many elephants lived, and it was impossible to census them by the normal aerial survey methods. We thought it might be as many as 500,000, and again, the upper estimates ran into millions. It took a long time to reach any consensus. There were several more attempts at drawing together elephant data over the next 8 years. It wasn't finally until 1987 that there was a consensus amongst most responsible scientists that the ivory trade was unsustainable. And until then, even amongst the very guardians of wildlife, the leading conservation organizations, there was no serious worries about what the ivory trade was doing. In retrospect, we now know that the biggest holocaust for the elephants took place in the late 70s and the early 80s. In 1987, the African Elephant Rhino Specialist Group reported to the over 100 nations that belong to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species that if the present trends continued, the elephants would in the near future be threatened with extinction. Following that conference, there was a major effort made to look at all aspects of elephant populations and the ivory trade, and 35 academics from varied disciplines, biologists, population dynamicists, modelers, economists, joined together to put together a work known as the Ivory Trade Review Study, which is this volume here. And this was submitted first to a meeting of the African Elephant Working Group of this CITES convention, which met in June, and subjected to peer review. Now at this time, a big divide opened up between the Southern African point of view and the point of view of most other countries on the African continent. And there are very different conditions which prevail. We've heard both sides now what has happened in Kenya, the colossal losses. Those losses in Kenya are by no means unique. In the whole of East Africa, which includes not only the three countries Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, but also Sudan, which is the largest country in Africa, and Somalia and Ethiopia, the elephants have fallen from something like 550,000 in 1979 to 110,000 today. Kenya itself, Richard Leakey told us, dropped from 65,000 to today's 17,000. But if you go back a few more years to 1973, it was estimated at 165,000. Perhaps one of the largest losses of all has been in the Celu game reserve. I first censused this huge reserve, which is 74,000 square kilometers with its surrounding areas, in 1976. By 1986, the number had dropped from 110,000 to 55,000. Now, over the last 3 years, it was crucial for us to find out whether the trends were easing up or whether they were accelerating. In the case of Celu, they accelerated, and the numbers have dropped further to today's 30,000. So this explains the intense alarm which is felt by countries like Kenya and Tanzania about the effects of the trade. And there is no doubt whatsoever that it is the trade which has fueled this elephant crisis. It is not the diminution of elephant range. That probably accounts for something like a 2% decrease per annum. But it cannot explain why the elephants have fallen so faster than other species. In the Celu Game Reserve, the buffalo haven't fallen at all, and many other species have come up. It's only the elephant and the rhino that have suffered catastrophic decreases. Likewise, to counter the argument that it's human range decrease, why would it be that in Zimbabwe, which is a country with one of the highest rates of human population growth, that the elephants actually have been increasing? I confirm and accept all those figures that we've been given from Zimbabwe and Botswana and South Africa. It's not an easy or a precise business censusing elephants. There are many difficulties, even in open country, of counting from an aeroplane. But nevertheless, there are standardized methods now of sampling, and we must accept that the counts made in southern Africa are just as good, or perhaps better, than anywhere else in the continent. But we have to look at the decreases and the increases in proportion. In the last decade, the total increases in southern African region have been something of the order of 50,000 elephants. In the same decade, the decreases in the whole of Africa have been 500,000 or more elephants. Furthermore, the increases in southern Africa, in Botswana, if we accept their early figures of 20,000 now increasing up to 62,000, it gives an annual increase of 15% a year, which is higher than any possible natural rate of increase. It must mean that either the early figures were too low, or the later figures were too high, or elephants have immigrated. Now, they can't have immigrated from Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe claims the same thing, that their elephants also have increased faster than the rate of natural increase. There is a possibility, however, that they may well have come across the border from Angola, across the Caprivi Strip. The answer is that it's a wild, desolate, very beautiful part of Africa where people don't really monitor very closely what's going on. I think it's one of the outstanding questions now is the question of the movements connected with this last huge, untouched or relatively untouched African elephant population that lives in northern Botswana and moves across into Zimbabwe. We would like, in fact, to help set up in newly independent Namibia a program to radio track elephants by satellite based in the Caprivi Strip to answer this fundamental question. But anyway, whatever, we have to accept that the overall condition of the elephant is one of vast decrease. And it's not even in southern Africa that all the elephants are going up there. We know that Zambia lost 150,000 elephants. We know that Mozambique has also lost something like 20 or 30,000 elephants. In fact, between 1981 and 1987, 43% of the elephants in the southern African region were lost. It was only in these few countries, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, that they either remained stable or went up. The latest information from Zimbabwe is that the elephants there in fact did not increase over the last decade. Or rather, they're still at the same level that they were 10 years ago. In the meanwhile, they went up a bit. They were then culled by about 6,000 animals, and they're now crawling up again. Really, what? Up already? Good God. Okay, sorry. I've been taking far too long. Now, briefly, over the decision that was taken at the CITES meeting, there were several proposals that were made. The Southern Africans claimed that the elephants should not be put on Appendix 2 and that the ivory trade should not be restricted, but they were prepared to compromise. They offered that if they should have a trading bloc, which include all the Southern African nations, that they would be quite content for the rest of Africa to put elephants on the endangered species lists. And they put forward a proposal to this purpose, including an acceptance of a temporary moratorium. Tanzania and Kenya and other countries wanted an all-out moratorium. But again, they were prepared to compromise too. And in the end, the Somalis put forward an amendment to the original Appendix 1 proposals to suggest that all the elephants should be put onto Appendix 1, but there should be an easy mechanism by which they could be replaced in Appendix 2 according to a set of criteria. And this, in the end, was what the nations voted for by an overwhelming majority vote. Unfortunately, the Southern Africans were not prepared to compromise and maintained that either all of them had to have Appendix 2 status or none of them would apply to be downgraded. And that is the way in which this most bitter and divisive wildlife conference that I have ever attended broke up. Zimbabwe declared that they would take a reservation and so would no longer, for the purposes of elephants, be a member of the treaty. And South Africa, I think, has also taken a reservation, but have agreed also that they will agree to this, they will respect the moratorium. I don't really think that there was so much difference between the two sides. And it's particularly important that we should not confuse this issue of culling elephants with the issue of banning the trade in ivory. I'm convinced that the ivory trade, unless it's controlled, would result in the near extinction of most of Africa's elephants. And it would only be a matter of time before the pressure came onto the southern African populations after the other populations had been wiped out. I'd like to end my 10 minutes, since I'm so far over time, by referring a little bit to the economics, because we do have to be pragmatic, and wild animals do have to pay their way today. Part of this ITRG study looked not just at how valuable ivory was and various other elephant products, but also how much people would value the viewing experience of just watching elephants. And a short study was made in Kenya, where they asked a batch of tourists how much they would be prepared to pay for the privilege of having elephants, and also the reverse question, how much they would be likely to cancel their holiday if there were no elephants to see. And by a series of econometric techniques, which I'm not familiar with, but I respect Gardner Brown, the professor who made this study, he concluded that the viewing value of Kenya's elephants alone was worth $25 million a year, and that if Kenya were to lose elephants at the same rate that it was losing them, they stood to lose $50 to $80 million annually. This is out of a total tourist trade that results from 250 to 300,000 visitors and is worth something like $375 million a year. Now, compared to that, Zimbabwe's loss of $1 million a year due to what they've lost through the ivory trade, it doesn't stand comparison. And although we appreciate that Zimbabwe will have lost revenue, the help that they're giving to the rest of Africa is of absolutely vital importance. Africa's total ivory earnings are only $50 million from ivory, of which perhaps only 10 to 20 million ever returns to the continent. If Zimbabwe were to actually calculate what their own viewing value of elephants was, it would probably put ivory in the shade. Well, I think I've probably said quite enough. So.
Well, it's precisely 7 o'clock, and we have a half an hour to have a discussion. People who want to ask questions, just hang on a minute, and when you do come, you please must use the microphones, please. Try to come to the microphones unless you have very good vocal cords so everybody can hear you. As moderator, I will take the privilege of asking the first question, or rather I will say that I, as a conservationist, particularly concerned with African wildlife, find myself absolutely perplexed. I really don't know what the answer is. I have every sympathy for the view for the protection that's afforded elephants in southern Africa. I fully recognize the need to keep cropping them, particularly as most of the southern African parks are now fenced in. There is no alternative. As a person who believes in recycling and the use of natural products and in utilization of wildlife, it's a very hard thing to think about destroying, just killing elephants and then destroying the products. And the ivory is a product that's been used for thousands of years, and it's a valuable product. I was struck by the fact, I think it was in one of Ian's articles, that if the greatest yield of ivory would be coming from letting elephants just live and die of old age and then collect the ivory, because they keep growing ivory all their lives. And if you just would leave the elephants alone, you could triple or quadruple the amount of ivory. It would take a long time. So to ask people in southern Africa, where they have managed to restrain poaching and have this terribly efficient wildlife system, to just keep on cropping elephants and then destroy the stockpiles. Is there another way of stopping the ivory trade if you stockpile ivory? I mean, do you have to destroy it? I don't know what the answer is, and I'd like to throw that question out of the panel and let somebody take it up. Anybody of the three here, and then the next questions belong to you.
I'll answer very briefly because it was a very long question. I am quite convinced that if we stockpile, others will stockpile too. And I think until such time as there is adequate protection for elephant in all the range states, to begin to stockpile would contribute directly to the return of poaching at the level that we have seen. I fully recognize the need to cull, and I want to make that absolutely clear. I think we're going to have enormous problems in Kenya a decade from, if not less, from now, with too many elephants in confined areas. I personally believe that the domestic utilization of elephant products, including skin and flesh, is legitimate. I think we need to look at the possibility of restricting export of raw materials and consider instead excluding ivory, which I believe because of its high value should be excluded, that skins and hides could be tanned in the country and turned into products that could be sold as curios to the tourist trade, on the understanding that the export would be granted to individuals for personal effects rather than the wholesale of objects that would become personal effects in a second or third country. I think on that basis there could be a constructive utilization. And I have been impressed by reports recently given out of Zimbabwe that I've read in the last 2 weeks, where Rowan Martin, who is often presented as my biggest opponent in this issue, said quite openly that out of 15 million Zimbabwean dollars a year that they've been getting from their elephant products, the ivory constituted only 1 million of that total, and that the meat and hide were the most important. So I think there's something that can be done, and I would like to be very positive about this.
What do you say about that, Dick?
Well, first of all, Rowan Martin, for your information, is Deputy Director of National Parks in Zimbabwe and an immaculate wildlife scientist with a great track record. The question of what Rowan is referring to is the net value from the culled elephant, of which Zimbabwe plows back the bulk to its own indigenous population. So that is not realized in the form of hard cash, which can then be used to carry out the sophisticated aerial census techniques that you've heard about and the humane culling operations which have to take place. The net yield is low. While I'm talking about the question of yield, we've touched on this matter of ecotourism, and is tourism the answer? Looking at Richard Leakey's figures, or figures that were quoted or attributed to him for Kenya last year, we find that the yield per tourist day was something of the order of $52. $52. Now, I'd like you just to compare that. Put your emotional cap aside for one moment. The yield from a trophy hunt for elephant in Zimbabwe is closer to $1,500. What does this mean? It means that you need 30 tourists for every hunter to yield the same amount of money per day. If you have excess elephants anyway, you might as well hunt them. If you can generate that kind of yield, think about the question of environmental impact. There are two people, at least at this table, who have been concerned with monitoring what happens to grazing animals when their range is trampled underfoot. As early as 1972, there were people worried about East Africa's reduction in grassland because of pressure from tourists. We have to look at ways of making
which, by their own admission, were in a state of chaos and where there was no hope that any ivory trade controls could operate. If they were not linked with Mozambique, it would have been very easy for them to be downgraded by the conference to Appendix 2 status and to continue trading with perhaps Japan alone. Japan alone has sufficient demand to sop up all the ivory produced by Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Even so, a moratorium would have been advisable. But the second point is that sport hunting, again, is not an issue in dispute. It is a perfectly legitimate form. I mean, I think anyone who wants to shoot an elephant is dumb. But if they do want to do that...
Let's control those emotions out there.
If they do want to do that, and it does bring in money, it may be a necessary thing to do, and I quite recognize that it is a legitimate practice. This, again, is not affected in the least by the movement which has led to the Appendix 1 status of the African elephant. It is still possible to export trophies from Africa under the Appendix 1 status.
Okay. People from the floor. Who wants to go first? Just a second. There's a lady ahead of you. Be second. You want to get over to the other mic? Yes, ma'am. Do you want to direct the questions through me? Tell me whether it's going to be to the panel at large or one particular individual.
Panel at large. I notice you are all white men. I wonder why there isn't a black man there, since these countries, for the most part, are being led by black men today. And how do the black leaders feel about this problem?
By consensus, I feel I have to answer this. If you had held this forum 7 months ago, the representative of the Kenya Wildlife Department would have been what you term a black man. As you correctly point out, Kenya is a black country run by black people, and the President of Kenya, with the support of the people, appointed me to replace the person who was my predecessor. I think increasingly Kenya and many other African countries are going the way that your country went. Most Americans are not red, as the Red Indians were. It is a melting pot. And I think we've got to get away from this idea that there are black countries and white countries and talk about countries and the people who represent them and work for them and who belong to them. And I can assure you that I speak with a full mandate and complete authority of the government and the people of Kenya.
Thank you.
Mr.
I might
Chairman,
just enlarge on that 1 second, that Richard Leakey found himself in the present position as director of Kenya Wildlife Services partly because he was one of the few people that spoke up openly in the East African Wildlife Journal, SWARA, and criticized what was happening. The situation was out of control. And he suggested, and I read in SWARA, I think it was last January, his proposal in a letter that Kenya should go back to the days when it had been a parastatal organization with its own board of trustees and no longer directly under the government. Next thing you know, he got his wish, and that's how he's landed in the hot seat today. Is that true?
I just going to say, if you'd like to stand on ceremony and continue this discussion in an African language, we can do that. Ngiyakwazi ukukhuluma isiZulu mina.
Mason Weinrich.
Yeah, thanks. I have a twofold question. The first one is directed to Richard Garstang, the second is a general one. Your point on the dangers of a black market is certainly very well taken. However, in this case, we also have a disappearance of the market, not only the source. And so I think the economics may be shifted a little bit, and I was wondering how you might address that. The other question to the panel in general is that obviously in Africa we have a situation where habitat is disappearing at a rapid rate, and that is causing some of the decline in elephants will continue to decline, and that land will continue to grow smaller. Do we continue culling for perpetuity, or do we at any point try and achieve a new balance in those lands, and at what point do we do that?
On the question of the black market, I think it's too early to say that the ivory market has been destroyed. I think what's happened is that the people that are trading in ivory are drawing their breath and looking at where else they can go. Much has been written about what has happened in Hong Kong. Not too much has been written about what is happening in Shenzhen. I would like to know whether what we see now is going to persist. I'm cynical about that. All the efforts to destroy the market for rhino horn have not destroyed the market for rhino horn. And it's had tragic consequences. The Kruger National Park has just had to indict one of its long-serving rangers, a man with 21 years service, for selling rhino horn over a period of some 17 years. How did this man's conscience get entirely subverted? It was the black market price of rhino horn that meant this guy could buy a farm after peddling in rhino horn illegally for a couple of years. I'm totally cynical about the likelihood that the gem value of ivory has been destroyed for all time. There's too much out there. There are too many people out there that have a major investment, and they will protect that investment. Money talks.
Could I comment just briefly on that? Because I think it is important, and you raise a very critical issue. Rhino horn has been bought by people traditionally who are, by their very definition, unlikely to be affected by peer pressure. The aphrodisiac seekers in the Far East and the sheikhs in the Gulf are people who have unlimited money in the latter case and also in the former, and I do not believe are subject to the normal consumer pressure that generally would affect the majority of those who seek to buy ivory, and I think there is a difference. The second thing I think is important, and I do believe it is important, and I'm not an economist any more than I'm anything else except a guy who's trying to help. There is something close to 1,200 tons of raw ivory in the Far East at the moment. Knowing of the people there, it's unlikely they're going to destroy this, and it's certain that they're going to find outlets for it. And they're going to find people who'll continue to buy, but there will be fewer of them. We know they're fewer because in America, in Canada, in France, in Norway, in Kenya, throughout the world, there has been a revulsion against this ivory. Those people who have 1,200 tons are going to continue to keep their price up by putting their ivory into that market that remains. That surely is going to ensure that for at least a period of time, they're not going to want to buy any more ivory from Africa. We may not stop the trade, but I think we're going to take the pressure off the elephant. And I do sincerely say the price of raw ivory in our part of Africa has dropped by a factor of about 50%, and ivory has been thrown away on several occasions by gangs who simply didn't want anything more to do with it. That has never happened before. Now, we don't know. We may be wrong. But we know it wasn't working before, and I think we should try something new.
Second part of your question, perhaps you'd like to repeat it.
The second part deals with the issue of culling and decreasing lands. It's sort of the same discussion that is had many times between preservationists in the U.S. and hunting groups and managers with deer here. But at what point do you try and achieve a new balance in these lands? Do you keep culling for perpetuity, or at some point do you say things have changed, a new balance must be established, and how do you ever get to that stage, and when do you do that?
Ian?
Really, the situation has been so varied across the whole of Africa that it is impossible to say that there is a single correct solution for the whole of Africa. We must accept that the culling as practiced in the Kruger National Park is effective. Whether people approve it or not, it has stabilized the elephants at a desired level, and they have a policy for the Kruger National Park that they do not want any big variations in elephant or plant numbers, whether or not these were natural in the past. In other places, such as Tsavo National Park, a very courageous decision was taken back in the late 60s not to cull elephants, but to try to allow the elephants and the vegetation to reach a new balance. And in that case, 10,000 elephants probably starved to death, but this was accepted as a necessary price at that time. What, curiously, nobody anticipated in the 60s in any of the management discussions that took place at that time was that their secure world of well-protected parks was about to have a wave of poaching break over it that would sweep everything away. A third example was the Lake Manyara National Park, where we had the same familiar elephant problem, and at one moment it became so desperate that we thought we would have to cull the elephants. It didn't happen, although the decision had been taken, and within a year, or within 18 months, a quarter of those elephants had died due to a completely unanticipated disease that had swept through the population. That solved that problem, and the plants began to regenerate. So the answer is there is no single correct solution for the whole of Africa, but each place must be judged on its own merits, according to its own tailored policy.
Very good. Next question. Here we are.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Leakey. A year ago, I had the pleasure of working with Bill and Danny Woodley down Tsavo National Park, and in talking with them, they were very cynical about the attitude of most of the officials in the Kenyan government about their desire to see the elephant saved. From what you said so far, it seems like things have changed a lot in a year. So I'd like to hear what your feelings on that, and if you have more time, your feelings on the Maasai and their role in preserving the elephant population.
Well, I think we do have a situation where Bill Woodley had hoped to be here this evening. But due to pressure of work in Kenya, it wasn't possible for him to come on this particular trip. He is still on my staff. I think, had he been here, I would have removed myself from the room so he could answer freely. But I do know what he would have said, and he would have said there has been a 180-degree turnaround in his attitude on that issue as a result of his experiences in the past 6 months. And I can say that, I think, with confidence. I think the situation with regard to the Maasai is a very complicated question, and one which we don't want to dwell at length here, because land ownership is a key. The people have written in learned, if not learned, popular journals in this country that the Maasai get nothing out of wildlife in Kenya. The Masai Mara, one of the biggest and most profitable wildlife areas in our country, is owned by the Maasai, and the local government that runs all the affairs of these people, including hospitals, schools, clinics, veterinary services, you name it, it's run by their budget, derives 96% of its revenue from the operations of the Masai Mara. And not 1% or 1 cent, let alone percent, of the revenue from the Masai Mara goes to the central government or the wildlife department. So they derive 100% benefit from that. However, as the Maasai individual wants to own land so that he can do something else with that land, there's a changing situation, and I believe that situation is more desperate to consider for the future than some of the issues we've been discussing here this evening.
The gentleman in a red sweater.
My question is directed to the panel as a whole. I believe you've very eloquently addressed the issue of the destruction of wildlife in East Africa. But one other malicious aspect of this trade, which I don't believe has been adequately addressed, is the exploitation of, this is another form of exploitation, I believe, of the African people, in that very little of the revenue from the sale of rhino horn and ivory revert to the people, very similar to the revenues from the sale of rubber and other natural resources. And I believe it's another form, and I would rather that you make a comment about this.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Just let me say, the trouble is a lot of this exploitation is illegal, certainly in our part of the world, and illegal people will do things the way they want to do. What we do perceive in Kenya, and we will introduce, and I'd like to address a comment that was made earlier. Yes, you would need 30 tourists to develop the revenue that he talks about in Zimbabwe as one solution to the problem. The other way to deal with the problem is increase the price the tourist pays to go into the park. You don't have to. There are lots of economic issues here that need to be considered. And in Kenya, the price to enter the park at the moment is $4. Less than a tot of whiskey.
For a week's wages.
In February, the price to enter Kenya parks will increase substantially, although not out of proportion to the benefit. And it will be a daily charge, and from the 1st of February, 25% of the face value of whatever ticket is sold will be put into a district development fund to build schools and clinics around that particular park. Your turn.
Did you want to say something?
Did you hear me say that? I forgot what the question was.
Well, it was concerning the exploitation of the African people.
Thank you. In my experience, selling wildlife to African people, indigenous African people, necessitates a very tangible proof that it is worth something to them. You have to physically cross the person's palm with something. Now, there's some really fascinating experiments running at this time which do just that. In the northern part of Namibia is the last remnant population of the type specimen of the black rhinoceros. It abounds in an area that is inhabited essentially by tribesmen, and there is a very low-key tourist operation running out there where the whole transaction is very visible. When you go and see those animals, you present the tribal headman in whose area you are with the money right there in his hand. It doesn't go into a bank account anywhere or get paid to a tour operator. It's very tangible and visible. And it's one of the most successful experiments in the sense that that community is protecting that black rhino population very effectively. When things went awry in Namibia a little while ago, the amount of poaching that took place on the black rhino population within the national park, within the Etosha National Park, was some 3 to 4 times higher than what it was in the adjacent area where the people believed in the resource. The fortress mentality of the national park did not work, despite the paramilitary patrols. The belief that the resource was worth something to the indigenous people worked by a factor of at least 3 to 4. And so it's a good point you're on, but it has to be visible, it has to be tangible, it must not take the form of money pouring back in at high level, which never filters down to the people at grassroots level. The key to this whole thing is grassroots reward for the coexistence at grassroots level with the resource.
Ian.
Just quickly to repeat what I said before, that if Africa's total ivory earnings were valued at $50 million per year, that's raw ivory, of which it was estimated that between 10 and 20 million came back to the continent. The rest of the profit going to the entrepreneurs.
Very good. The lady at this microphone, please. I don't know just what the order is, but we'll take them in alternate feed.
First of all, I'd just like to say that I love elephants because this question is going to make me sound like I don't. What I'd like to ask is, how do you justify, at a time of such high diversity loss in the world, just saving an elephant, or the elephants, when I know in Africa there's a lot of other species that are going extinct, and I'd just like somebody to comment on priorities, because in my view, I think maybe we should be going after a higher diversity ecosystems and putting our money there.
Can I go through the line?
Yeah.
Stop the other way.
Yes, go on, Ian.
Yeah, but I'm in the middle.
Well, you stay there and you'll get your turn next.
Thank you. You've got to bully your way around sometimes.
Go on, Ian.
On this,
Well, no, I thought we were starting with
You want
Ian.
to start in the middle.
Oh, all right, fine.
that's fair.
I'm easygoing.
On the question of a loss of diversity, this is precisely what the Zimbabwean and South African national parks ecologists are concerned about, is a loss of species diversity. The simple fact is, you've probably heard of super predators. The elephant is a super herbivore. It feeds through a greater range than any other animal is capable of doing, from below ground level to 20 feet in the trees with ease, and even higher by pushing those trees down. That can result in them literally eating other animals out of house and home before they eat themselves out of house and home. The story of Tsavo, if you look at it carefully, is a loss of species diversity in addition to a crash in the elephant population. And incidentally, I didn't see figures of 10,000, but 40,000. I wonder if you'd comment on that. So species diversity, the maintenance of species diversity is the key. If you'd like to read an interesting paper, Dr. Ken Tinley has written a paper on that very subject. I forget which journal, but we could probably remember by the end of the evening.
Something wrong with my mic. Ian, carry on.
Well, of course, that particular national park situation is only a tiny little minority of Africa's elephant range that suffers from too many elephants. There's probably 1% of Africa's elephant range is well protected, and therefore is likely to have a high density of elephants in which you get a decrease in bushland. This does not always mean a decrease in diversity. In Tsavo, on the contrary, it was preceded by an increase in diversity. But looking at the wider case, Africa's elephants are an easier thing for people to focus on than an ecosystem here or there. If Africa's elephants are to survive, it's obvious that their ecosystems have to be preserved as a matter of first order priority. The ivory crisis is really a short-term problem. If we solve it by hook or by crook, by one way or another, we still have the long-term problem, which is preserving the ecosystem. And I would see elephants as a symbol for the ecosystem. They occupy just about every one where they occur. So you can use them almost as an indicator. If they're doing well in most of Africa, it means that that ecosystem has been preserved.
Very good. We are approaching 7:30, and I think we ought to try to wind up the questions, and maybe we could stretch it for another 5 minutes, although I haven't received any
I
instructions.
think we should get final statements from the panel.
That's a good idea. You mean before? All right. Well, let's let him ask a question. That's great. Nobody discussed final questions with me, but that's fine.
I think
Statements, right?
this is the panel in general. You touched on the subject, but I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit, and I realize that may be speculation, but why are the poaching pressures so much heavier in the East African area than in the Southern African area? And is there any lessons to be learned that might be applied in the areas that are suffering heavy poaching?
Ian, you go first.
Yeah, Ian, what's
I
the answer?
think, for a start, we've had a much more formidable type of poacher in East Africa. I don't think that Zimbabwe and Botswana and South Africa have been exposed to the likes of Somali poachers or Sudanese soldiers and the types of people who are highly armed. There's been a great proliferation of automatic weapons that have come into the hands of poachers due to the small wars that have taken place. And these people are ruthless, and some of them quite good shots as well. Add to that the problem of underfunding, indiscipline and mismanagement, which I'm happy to say in Kenya is now radically on another course, and you have all the ingredients for a higher level of poaching in East and Central Africa rather than Southern Africa.
I might just say one thing about that, that there's a lot more money, there's a lot more development in Zimbabwe and South Africa than in East Africa. There have been much richer countries, and they have put a lot more money into their wildlife departments, and they have many more rangers, and then it's just much bigger staffs that East Africa has had. So that's a large part of it right there. All right, if we're done with the questions, and I guess we are, we will then have final statements. And Richard, you lead off.
I just want to make two comments for the record, and I feel it's necessary to do so with all respect. Firstly, we were told that South Africa was the only place in which the rhino population was increasing, particularly the white rhino. Our figures are not so impressive, but white rhino are increasing in Kenya, where we have something like 67 white rhino from a population that 10 years ago was, I think, 8. The total population on the private ranches in Kenya of white rhino is quite substantial today, and they are increasing, as are the black rhino under current protection. The second point I'd like to make on behalf of Africa as a Kenyan is that whilst I appreciate the remark that in Namibia, the last refuge of the black rhino that was traditionally valued as important, one must also remember that that part of the world was also the second last refuge of colonialism. And I think the attitudes to wildlife in Namibia will change, and they will change in the light of some of the remarks that I made at the beginning. I think we have to be very, very careful, and I would say to you, sir, with all respect, that some of your remarks about native attitudes in Africa to wildlife are unacceptable in the contemporary Africa.
All right. Dick Garstang.
I'll waive what I had to say and address that last remark. If we are dealing with a conservation recipe for post-colonial Africa, then I don't see any necessity for repeating the exercise that has been carried out already in East Africa, and which, by everyone's admission, until very recently at least, was a dismal failure. We believe that wildlife utilization is the way to convince the indigenous people of Africa that they can cohabit with Africa's wildlife resources. We believe that by looking at every aspect of wildlife utilization, including the proper utilization of animals that have to be killed or culled, whichever you prefer, in order to create a stable balance within the islands of natural range that exist, we believe that that is a good long-term investment. We believe that that ecotourism in the broadest sense, including eco-trade, but excluding eco-colonialism and eco-imperialism, is the key to Africa's wildlife surviving.
Is that it? So, Ian, your turn.
I would like to say that I think in 1989 we've seen more progress towards the halting of the destruction of Africa's elephants than we have in the previous 15 years. That there is a new pragmatism in parts of Africa, which we have seen in the appointment of Richard Leakey and the other realistic measures which have been taken in Kenya, the appointment of a new director in Tanzania, also of a high caliber, dedicated man, highly capable. I hope that we will see the sweeping away further of the corrupt elements who've been involved in the trade, and a new willingness on the part of donors to get involved in what is also world heritage. There is a plan that has been put together by an African Conservation Coordinating Group, which is now planning to send missions across Africa to look at different ways of conserving elephants in different countries. And I think now we've got to turn our back on the past of what the trade has done, never to allow it to regain the sort of terrible effect that it had, and to try now to preserve the elephants in a more effective way.
Thank you all very much for coming. And keep in mind that what you do as an individual may have an effect on what the future of the elephant is. I certainly am convinced that the first thing we have to do if we're going to save the elephant is try at least to have a moratorium on the ivory trade and knock it down so that the price for ivory drops. And the main thing, the one thing we're all interested in on both East Africa and Southern Africa is in seeing the elephants survive. It's tremendously important, and you can help tangibly by giving money. The money for equipment and so forth. Every cent that comes from these, not just from tourists. We don't have that many tourists going to Africa compared to our population. But if you wanted to make a contribution, you can do it tonight in the form of a check going to the International Task Force, which will go directly into the research and into the anti-poaching efforts going on in Kenya, and for surveys and so forth of monitoring the situation. So I want to put in a plug for donations to help along the process. Thank you very much. Good night.